She's one of the most recognizable celebrity daughters in Hollywood. But according to her, the reality behind the name looks very different than people assume. Rumer Willis says she works 4 different jobs, supports her child on her own, and does not live off a trust fund, despite widespread online assumptions to the contrary. And what makes this moment especially revealing isn't just what she said, it's why she felt the need to say it at all. Because this isn't a story about wealth or fame. It's a story about perception, pressure, and the quiet expectations people place on others without ever asking a question. The moment that sparked the conversation was simple, almost casual. In an Instagram reel, Rumer Willis appears holding everyday items, the kind associated with routine and responsibility. Around her, text labels common parts of daily life: lunch, playdates, meal prep, workouts. At the top, a phrase reads, "Single moms be like." Nothing dramatic, nothing confrontational, just a snapshot of modern motherhood. But the response online told a different story. Comments quickly shifted the tone, not toward the video itself, but toward assumptions about her life. Some suggested that her experience couldn't possibly be comparable to other parents. Others implied she had an invisible safety net that made her situation fundamentally different. Rather than letting those interpretations speak for her, Willis responded directly. She clarified that she works 4 separate jobs to support her 2-year-old daughter, Louetta. She stated that she is the sole provider, and she addressed one of the most persistent assumptions head-on, saying she does not live off a trust fund and does not receive money from her parents. That clarification alone changed how many people viewed the original post. But what followed added even more context. Later that same day, Willis shared a longer message after a follower commented that, regardless of her current situation, she would always have a backup plan if things went wrong. Instead of reacting defensively, she chose a measured, reflective response. She acknowledged something important right away. She said she is fully aware that she has privileges that many people do not. She does not deny that reality, and she does not take it for granted. But she also explained that the original post was never meant to compare lives, or erase differences, or minimize anyone else's struggles. According to her, the intention was to speak to shared experiences, not to compete over hardship. This distinction matters, because online conversations often collapse nuance into extremes, either total relatability or complete dismissal. Willis argued that both things can exist at the same time. Someone can acknowledge privilege and still experience pressure. Someone can have support systems and choose not to rely on them. Someone can appear secure from the outside while still carrying responsibility internally. She emphasized that she does not live her life treating her family as a fallback plan. Providing for herself and her daughter is something she takes pride in. She also addressed another common assumption, that having famous parents means never understanding financial stress. According to her, that idea simply isn't accurate. She stated that there were years when she was the sole provider, and that the suggestion she doesn't work or doesn't understand financial pressure doesn't reflect her reality. At this point, the conversation shifted, because the story stopped being about a single Instagram post and became about something broader. Why do certain people have to prove their effort, while others are automatically believed? Why does visibility invite judgment instead of curiosity? And why does the public struggle to hold 2 truths at once? Willis herself framed it carefully. She said, "People move through different layers of reality, different circumstances, different challenges. And acknowledging those differences doesn't mean shared experiences suddenly disappear." That framing resonated with many and irritated others, because it challenges a common online reflex to reduce complex lives into simplified categories, especially when famous last names are involved. As the daughter of Bruce Willis and Demi Moore, Rumer Willis exists at an intersection the public feels unusually entitled to comment on. Success is assumed, support is presumed, struggle is questioned, and when she pushes back, calmly, thoughtfully, it exposes how quickly empathy disappears once privilege enters the conversation. But this is where the story becomes more interesting, because the reaction to her response revealed just as much as the original comments. Some people applauded her transparency. Others argued the point wasn't about her intentions, but about the larger system. And that tension between individual experience and collective reality is where the conversation truly lives. Which raises a deeper question. When we talk about shared experiences, who gets to speak and who gets told they're not allowed to? And why does acknowledging complexity feel threatening in online spaces built on instant judgment? That question doesn't end with Rumer Willis. It opens into something much bigger. What happened next wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it revealed something quietly powerful about how online narratives form. Once Willis clarified her position, the discussion split into two parallel conversations. One focused on her words, the other focused on what people projected onto them. Some viewers took her statements at face value, seeing them as a reminder that public perception often flattens real life. Others argued that intention doesn't erase context, and that conversations about struggle are inseparable from broader social realities. And this is where nuance becomes uncomfortable, because nuance asks people to slow down. Willis didn't claim her experience was the same as every other parent's. She didn't suggest hardship exists on a single scale. She didn't deny structural differences or unequal starting points. In fact, she explicitly acknowledged them. What she challenged was something else entirely: the assumption that recognizing privilege automatically invalidates personal responsibility, effort, or pressure. That assumption shows up frequently, especially online. If someone has a recognizable last name, their work is often reframed as optional. If someone appears financially stable, their stress is often dismissed as performative. If someone speaks about responsibility, the response is sometimes not curiosity, but correction. And yet, according to publicly available information and her own statements, Willis's life today includes the same unglamorous logistics. Many parents recognize schedules, planning, work, and constant prioritization. She described herself not as someone seeking sympathy, but as someone responding to judgment. That distinction matters, because there's a difference between asking to be understood and asking to be exempt. Her longer message emphasized exactly that. She explained that she doesn't approach life assuming someone will step in if things fall apart. She approaches it with the mindset that responsibility is hers, and hers alone. That mindset, she said, is something she values deeply. And then she introduced an idea that quietly reframed the entire debate. She said we can hold two truths at the same time. That phrase is simple, but it challenges how online discourse usually works, because digital conversations tend to reward absolutes. Either you struggle or you don't. Either you're privileged or you're relatable. Either your voice is valid or it isn't. But real life doesn't operate that way. Someone with stability can still feel pressure. Someone with opportunity can still experience uncertainty. Someone with support can still choose independence. Acknowledging one doesn't erase the other. This is where many reactions diverged. Some people appreciated the reminder that experiences exist on a spectrum. Others felt the conversation itself highlighted why comparisons can be frustrating in the first place. And that tension isn't accidental. Social media platforms compress complex lives into short-form moments. Posts, clips, captions. Those moments invite interpretation without context, and context often arrives only after assumptions have already solidified. By the time Willis clarified her position, many opinions were already formed, which leads to another uncomfortable reality. Online discussions don't always seek understanding. They often seek alignment. People look for statements that confirm what they already believe. And when something challenges that belief, the response isn't always curiosity, it's resistance. Willis's comments didn't fit neatly into one category. They didn't deny privilege. They didn't glorify struggle. They didn't ask for special treatment. They simply asked for space to speak about her experience without it being rewritten by assumptions. And that request alone sparked a debate. Because when someone refuses to play a familiar role, whether it's out-of-touch celebrity or relatable every parent, the audience has to confront its own expectations. This moment wasn't about proving anything. It was about drawing a boundary between what people assume and what someone actually says, between public narratives and private responsibility. And once that boundary was drawn, It exposed something larger than one individual. It revealed how quickly conversations about work, parenting, and responsibility turn into symbolic battles, where people argue less about facts and more about what those facts represent. The question stopped being, is she telling the truth? And became, what does her truth mean for how we talk about struggle? That's where the real tension lives, because if we accept that experiences are layered, then the conversation becomes harder. It requires listening instead of labeling, understanding instead of ranking, context instead of comparison. And not everyone is comfortable with that shift. But here's the part that often gets overlooked. Willis didn't frame her message as a conclusion. She framed it as an opening. She said there's room for compassion without turning life into a competition, room to acknowledge difference without erasing common ground. That idea challenges how quickly online spaces move toward division, and it raises a final, lingering question. If shared experiences don't require identical circumstances, why do we insist on treating them that way? Because the answer to that question doesn't just apply to celebrities. It applies to how we talk about work, parenting, pressure, and who we believe is allowed to speak about them. By the time the conversation settled, one thing became clear. This was never just about an Instagram reel. It was about how quickly public narratives replace personal context, especially when familiarity creates a sense of entitlement. When people believe they already know your story, they stop listening to what you actually say. And that's the quiet pressure many public figures face. Not criticism alone, but pre-written conclusions. In Willis's case, the conclusion many people jumped to was simple. If you come from a famous family, your effort must be optional. Your stress must be symbolic. Your responsibility must be shared, even if you say it isn't. But what her response highlighted is something more subtle. She wasn't arguing that her life is harder than anyone else's. She wasn't asking to be placed on the same scale. She was asking not to be erased from the conversation entirely, because there's a difference between recognizing systemic inequality and dismissing individual experience. Those two ideas don't cancel each other out. They coexist. And when we refuse to allow that coexistence, we don't create fairness. We create silence. That's why her phrase about holding two truths at once resonated beyond her own situation. It applies to countless conversations we have online every day about work, about parenting, about responsibility, about pressure. We often assume that acknowledging one truth automatically invalidates another, but real life is layered. Someone can be grateful and overwhelmed, privileged and accountable, supported and independent. When we reduce people to categories, we lose the ability to understand them. And when understanding disappears, judgment fills the gap. What's interesting is that Willis didn't escalate the situation. She didn't attack her critics. She didn't dramatize the response. She slowed it down. She clarified. She contextualized. She invited nuance, and that approach alone shifted the tone for many viewers. Not because it won the argument, but because it reframed it. The discussion moved away from defending a personal claim and toward examining how we talk about shared experiences in a public space. That shift is rare online, and it's uncomfortable, because it asks everyone involved to sit with complexity instead of choosing sides. It asks us to consider that visibility doesn't erase effort, that background doesn't define every outcome, and that listening matters just as much as reacting. In the end, this story isn't about proving who struggles more. It's about understanding why we're so quick to decide who's allowed to speak at all. Rumer Willis didn't ask for sympathy. She asked for accuracy, and in doing so, she exposed something many people recognize but rarely name: that assumptions travel faster than context, especially online. The bigger question this moment leaves us with isn't about celebrities or privilege. It's about us. How often do we listen to understand? And how often do we listen to confirm what we already believe? And what would change if we allowed room for more than one truth at a time?